Welcome to Diplomatic Front. I am Ambassador Richard Bernal and Professor of Practice at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies. I will be hosting this program on major international issues. The objective is to go beyond the information of what happened and when, and to provide an analysis which explains why and what were the major personalities and trends which influenced these events. World trade in the last decade has struggled. In the 50 years since the Second World War, global trade grew rapidly, and indeed it grew much faster than domestic economies grew. Hence, the world became more globalized. International trade began to be a driver of economic growth. Many countries switched to a strategy of export-led growth to capture the benefits of a more liberalized multilateral trading system. The international trading system since the Second World War was managed by what was called the GATT, G-A-T-T, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was an informal organization and operated from a headquarters in Geneva. In the early 1990s, this organization was transformed into the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has three functions. One, to liberalize barriers to international trade. Two, to adjudicate disputes that arise from the interpretation of the rules. And three, to provide aid for trade. Aid for trade is assistance provided to developing countries to enable them to implement their obligations under the WTO agreements. In recent years, the WTO has lagged in terms of its ability to liberalize international trade, and it has become the subject of controversy. Some people have argued that it is no longer serving its purpose and it should either be reformed or eliminated. I happen to feel that there is a continuing role for the World Trade Organization. The circumstances internationally are not propitious for the continuation of liberalization of international trade because of the pushback against globalization and the disappointments from those who expected more from a liberalized multilateral trading system. There is the important function of adjudicating the disputes which arise from rules and also helping developing countries to meet their obligations. Meanwhile, the WTO continues, and hopefully the international context will change in a way which will be more propitious to the continuation of its three functions. Recently, a new head of the World Trade Organization was elected, and she brings to that role the following. She's a PhD in economics trained at the MIT in the United States, formerly a vice president of the World Bank and also Minister of Finance of Nigeria. This is an important time for us to assess the state of the World Trade Organization. My guest today is Annabel Gonzalez. She's a Costa Rican citizen who has served as Minister of Trade for Costa Rica and was involved in several negotiations, notably the World Trade Organization, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and was a lead negotiator for the CAFTA, the Central America DR-US Free Trade Agreement. She's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute for International Economics in Washington, which is rated as one of the top 3 think tanks in the United States. In addition, she has been a director at the World Bank and a director at the World Trade Organization. She is eminently qualified to speak to us about the issues relating to the WTO. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
It's
you.
been a while. We know each
Yeah.
other well from jousting in the negotiations at the WTO and the Free Trade Area of the Americas, but we have managed to remain good friends.
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation.
World trade has struggled in the last decade, and this year gone has been particularly bad. It's estimated that world trade declined by almost 10%. The outlook for world trade is not very encouraging. What is your view of the outlook and prospects for the resumption of growth in world trade?
So in April 2020, supply chains were facing a deep and multifaceted shock. Forced reduction in production, steep changes in demand, severe transportation disruptions, and unprecedented business uncertainty. So at the time, it was expected that global trade flows would suffer the largest decline in the past 70 years, falling by as much as a third. Fast forward to today, and the latest data shows that trade did not perform as bad as expected, back in April last year. And latest data shows that it will fall, or it will show that for 2020 it fell maybe little less than 10%, after it returned to pre-pandemic levels in November last year. And it was being pushed basically by increasing demand for essential medical supplies, for electronics and other products in advanced economies, and by the corresponding revamped exports from China and from East Asian firms. Now, we know that the story for trade in services is very different, has been severely impacted, of course, by the lockdown and the restrictions. So in November last year, services trade was still 16% below 2019 levels. And it is estimated that at least half of services trade easily stands compromised by the pandemic. So recovery is expected in 2021, but it will be subdued and subject to uncertainty and downside risks. So we are not still out of the bushes, I think.
Uh, what is the role of the World Trade Organization in prompting a resumption of growth in world trade?
So I think that the WTO has a critical role to play in providing stability, certainty, and to underpin global trade. But the WTO has been under significant strain in the past few years. We've had national security tariffs and the breakdown of the appellate body that have taken a toll on the organization. US-China tensions have had a chill effect in the WTO. And of course, the pandemic has brought increased trade frictions. But the reality also is that trouble has been brewing for some time. WTO members have been unable to resolve tensions over the application of existing procedural rules on notifications, on transparency, and other issues, and also on substantive disciplines, including, the diverging views of whether some rules would need to be reformed or not. And in addition, the inability to negotiate new agreements has impaired the WTO capacity to keep up with the challenges of the evolving trade landscape, of technological change, and the role of emerging countries in the global economy. So for the WTO to remain relevant, it must be reformed. And things, I think, should begin to change in 2021 under the leadership of its new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Many people have been discussing the future of the World Trade Organization. Opinions range from it should be closed down as it is no longer functioning, no longer relevant, to it needs to be reformed to adjust to the new political realities. What is your view?
Well, I think that if we did not have the WTO, we would need to create it. The WTO plays a very important role in underpinning trade flows, but also in providing the business certainty that is required for companies to invest, to produce, to export, to import. Now, having said that, the WTO has been going through some trouble, and it is very important that members commit to reforming the organization. And it needs to be reformed in several ways. We need an organization that can result in negotiations, negotiations that lead to new agreements, agreements to cover new areas of the economy, for instance, when you think about electronic commerce, but also agreements to cover some of the issues from the past, for example, in the area of agriculture, that still need to be sorted out. We also need an organization that helps to monitor and bring additional transparency to the policies of their members. And last but not least, we need an organization that has an effective dispute settlement body that allows for members to sort out their conflicts based on rules and not in a power-driven way. So changes are required in the negotiating function, in the monitoring function, and in dispute settlement function. But I am hopeful that the entrance of the new Director General on the one hand, a new administration in the US, and what I sense to be a renewed energy within the system will provide a glimmer of hope in terms of what can be done in going forward.
The new Director General, in her early presentations at the WTO, put forward some ideas about how to make the WTO more effective, including a special department to assist in the implementation of trade obligations. Would you comment on what this is likely to achieve?
Well, that's a very important question, Richard, because the WTO has a list of issues to address, and it is, the issues are of a different nature, but they, I think, should be adequately sequenced to avoid a system overload. So we have a great opportunity, and I think this is what the Director General has been referring to with the next WTO Ministerial Conference, which is the gathering of all trade ministers and the top body of the organization, which is scheduled for end November this year. This 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, or MC12 as we call it, should focus, in my view, on achieving realistic, concrete results that could build confidence on the ability of members to engage. And then second, on establishing a set of work programs to tackle substantive issues and WTO institutional reform. And I think this is feasible, but the pace of negotiation needs to be accelerated if results are to be achieved by November. And I think that the establishment by the Director General of this new delivery unit goes in the direction precisely of providing greater support to the membership in order to be able to achieve positive results in November. So what could we be talking about here? This could mean, for example, how can the WTO help fight the pandemic? There is a view, and certainly it's a view that I share, that the WTO should make a practical difference to supporting fast and equitable access to vaccines by all countries. And there is a role that the WTO can play in monitoring, in transparency, but also in restricting export curbs that can be very detrimental to the access to vaccines, for example. Another aspect that could result in agreement in November could be the conclusion of the negotiations on fishery subsidies, which is an important issue that has been ongoing for a while. Also quite important, WTO members have been discussing a number of agreements, which are called joint statement initiatives, on topics like electronic commerce, investment facilitation, services, domestic regulation, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and women in trade, that could potentially either, make significant progress, or maybe in the case of some of them, be ready to deliver results. So I think this combination of pragmatic, concrete results to show that that members in the organization can engage and can produce results on the one hand, and then setting work programs to fix the dispute settlement system and fully restoring the appellate body function, on discussing issues of industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, related topics that are very important also to level the playing field, thinking about a work program on WTO reform to strengthen monitoring, strengthen transparency. All of these are important issues that require a work program so that members could focus their attention immediately after MC12 on this more challenging, more substantive issues, if you wish, but that are critical for the future of the organization.
I happen to agree with you that the WTO can make some momentum in international trade reform by focusing on issues rather than trying to have one huge multilateral round of negotiations. Now, developing countries have been very disappointed on the whole by the results from the WTO liberalization process. What would have to be done to bring them enthusiastically back into the negotiations? Because the Doha development round has been stillborn for a long time. What has to be done to re-engage the majority of developing countries?
I think one very important issue, Richard, is negotiations. And in my view, there are a number of topics that are of great significance to developing countries. We discussed, for instance, the issue of health and trade. The majority of developing countries, for instance, are not manufacturers of certainly not of vaccines, but of the diagnostics, of the therapeutics, and others. So an initiative that would guarantee access to all developing countries, I think, is of great interest to all of the developing world. Likewise, I think that there is a discussion that will have greater significance in the WTO on issues related to trade and environment. In particular, what role can the WTO play in support climate sustainability? And here again, this is a critical issue for many developing countries, and the WTO can actively play a role as well. Also, another example in the area of electronic commerce. We know that electronic commerce can be a potentially inclusive mechanism to bring in smaller firms, women in trade, to benefit from the opportunities of exporting. But again, we are lacking a comprehensive framework in the WTO to govern digital trade. So I think if we look at the different areas, there is a very important contribution that the WTO can make. And I think that this is an agenda that is of great interest to many developing countries. But of course, the other side of the equation is that it is important for developing countries to sit at the table, because as you and I know, coming from smaller developing countries, it is not always easy in broader settings, to convey your views. But then again, it's about forming alliances. It's about presenting joint positions. And most importantly, it's about being there at the negotiating table.
Finally, the action on trade negotiations in recent years seem to have shifted to large regional agreements. Is it possible to put regional negotiations and the WTO in harmony? Or is there a contradiction between regional agreements and the WTO?
So I think that there is a role for regional agreements and another role for the multilateral system. So I think in regional agreements, there is room to innovate. Maybe there are new areas that you want to develop disciplines first among a smaller group of countries, and that's one way of doing so. Also, regional agreements can sometimes go deeper. For instance, when you think about regional agreements among neighboring countries, they may need to deal with other issues like border crossings and other issues that are important to them. And also, regional agreements can be very important in terms of spearheading regional value chains. Having said that, I think that there are some issues that can only be tackled at the multilateral level. When you think, for instance, about the issues of subsidies on the industrial products, domestic support in the area of agriculture. By the nature of them, they need to be tackled in the multilateral system. Likewise, you need to make sure that there is a mechanism at the multilateral level that works well for solving disputes. If we look at the track record of regional trade agreements, most of them have never really been used as a mechanism for settling controversies, with members preferring to go, until very recently, to the WTO. So the WTO is also a place to have these trade agreements, these dispute settlement mechanisms. But finally, it is also a place for many of the smaller developing countries to be able to find, to find the rules that would apply to them on a non-discriminatory basis. Because a number of these countries are still not part of the large regional agreements. And I think that they would be in a clear disadvantage if, for example, modern frameworks in the area of electronic commerce would only apply among a set of members and rather to, and instead of all the membership. So I think there is potential for friction. One needs to be mindful, be watchful, but I think there's also a role for each of them and that they can also be complementary.
Annabelle, thank you so much for sharing your vast experience and in-depth knowledge with us. Look forward to talking to you again at a time in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, for the invitation.
In recent times, the discussion in international fora has been dominated by the availability of vaccines against the COVID-19 pandemic and its mutations. The issue has two aspects. First, there's the availability of supplies on a timely basis for all countries. And secondly, the price at which the vaccines are available. It has been a major problem for developing countries to both get supplies and to afford to pay for those supplies. Recently, South Africa and India raised the issue in the World Trade Organization of a waiver of the intellectual property rights protecting the producers of vaccines. The production of vaccines has been dominated by pharmaceutical companies in the United States and Europe. They have argued strenuously that they can produce adequate supplies and that it would be difficult to produce those supplies anywhere else because of the technology and the production process. However, developing countries have argued that it is need on the basis of humanitarian concerns that these vaccines should be made available for production everywhere. Recently, the United States took the decision to support the waiver for the vaccines. These issues continue to be unresolved, but momentum is building for the waiver. The waiver has some history because it first came up in regard to drugs for the treatment of HIV/AIDS. It did not succeed at that time. It is again now, perhaps in more graphic terms and on a larger scale, that the issue is being raised. The pharmaceutical companies have strenuously lobbied, spent considerable money trying to discourage the government of the United States and those in Europe from supporting the waiver. It seems to me at this stage that these companies are going to resist, and even when a waiver is given, they will be in the position to restrict the extent to which they meet the terms of that waiver. It seems that what is needed here is a practical solution which allows these companies to continue to hold the intellectual property rights while making available the formulas on a license basis for manufacturing throughout the world. This allows them to make some profits, less profits than they do if they monopolize production, and it allows all countries that have the manufacturing capability to produce supplies of the vaccines. What remains at issue is the affordability, and what needs to happen here is that the global community sets up a special facility to which the developed countries can contribute to provide grants to developing countries to allow them to purchase the vaccine. What this does is to get around the issue of the waiver, which may not succeed, allow the companies to continue to feel comfortable to invest large sums of money in research and development of drugs, and increasing the supply globally of the vaccines which are urgently needed at this time. And the special facility to provide grants to developing countries will allow them to purchase the facility without further complicating their difficult fiscal situations and increasing their indebtedness. Today we discussed the state of international trade and the role of the World Trade Organization. I'm very pleased to share with you that subsequent to our interview with Annabel Gonzalez, she has been appointed one of the 4 Deputy Director Generals of the World Trade Organization. I want to thank our global audience of viewers for joining us today and invite them to reconvene with me on the next episode of Diplomatic Front.